For 3 years, every powerful man who walked through the doors of Caruso's Southside restaurant passed the same woman at the back table and never once thought to look twice. Victor Delano made that mistake on a Tuesday evening in November. By Thursday morning, he had lost his import license. His offshore accounts were flagged for federal review, and every legitimate business partner he had cultivated over a decade had received a very precise, very damaging letter from an anonymous source. The woman at the back table had not moved from her seat. She hadn't needed to, but the end only makes sense when you understand what it cost her to build it. Valentina Moreno was 31 years old, 5'4", and built with the kind of full-bodied solidity that certain men felt the need to comment on, as though her presence in a room required their editorial approval before it could be legitimate. She had heavy, dark hair she kept in a low knot. Reading glasses she rarely needed but wore anyway, and the particular stillness that reads as invisibility to people who aren't paying attention. She held a master's degree in forensic accounting from the University of Chicago, and she had a quiet, methodical mind that could trace money through 17 shell companies across 4 countries the way most people trace a thread through fabric, patiently, precisely, without ever losing the line. She had been working for Marcus Caruso for 3 years. Officially, she was the back-office financial consultant for his legitimate holdings: 3 restaurants, 2 real estate development companies, a logistics firm. Unofficially, she was the reason those holdings had remained clean enough that no federal audit had ever found a single irregularity worth pursuing. Marcus Caruso was 44 years old, silver at the temples, and he ran the South Side the way a surgeon runs a difficult procedure, with economy of movement, complete focus, and very little patience for noise. He had built his reputation over 2 decades on a single principle. He did not threaten people twice. The men who worked for him moved carefully, spoke carefully, and never made the mistake of confusing his stillness for softness. He had hired Valentina because his previous accountant had made a structural error in a holding company's tax filings that would have cost Marcus 4 years of work to untangle. Valentina had found the error in 6 hours on her first day and had left a single handwritten note on his desk, explaining the error, the correction, and 3 additional vulnerabilities she had identified that nobody had asked her to find. Marcus read the note twice. Then he said nothing to her for 2 days. That was how it had started. For 3 years, Valentina sat at the back table of Caruso's, the one the staff called the quiet table because no one was ever formally seated there, with her laptop and her files and her coffee. The men who moved through that room saw a woman working. They saw a body they felt entitled to assess. They did not see what she was actually doing, because what she was doing did not look like power, and power, in their world, had a very specific appearance. Psychologists who study organizational dynamics have documented this pattern with precision. In their research on status camouflage, Dr. Joyce Fletcher and Linda Balin identified what they called disappearing work. Skilled, high-value labor that becomes invisible precisely because it doesn't conform to how authority is expected to look. The more competent Valentina was, the easier it became for the men around her to read her as background. Her competence registered as administrative, as support, as furniture. Valentina had understood this for years. She had stopped fighting it a long time ago. She had started using it instead. What she had built in 3 years of careful, unremarked presence was a map. Not just of Marcus's finances, but of everyone who moved through that room. Every deal referenced near her table. Every name dropped in conversation she had overheard while appearing to read a spreadsheet. Every financial structure that had passed through her hands and revealed, through its architecture, what the person who built it was afraid of and what they were reaching for. She knew the South Side's money the way a doctor knows a body. Nagi indivai itayuts. Not just the surface, but the systems underneath. Nobody watching her at that back table would have understood what they were looking at. That was exactly the point. Victor Delano was 52 years old and had spent his entire adult life believing that status was something a man wore on the outside. in the cut of his suit, in how a room quieted when he entered, in who laughed at his jokes. He had legitimate import and export interests, a city council connection he had cultivated for 8 years, and a deep, structural need to be the largest thing in any room he entered. His need was not cruelty exactly. Or not only cruelty, it was what John Bowlby, in his foundational work on attachment theory, identified as the behavioral residue of insecure early bonds, a man who had learned, very young, that safety was conditional on dominance, and who had spent 50 years constructing an external architecture of power to manage an internal experience of smallness. He was not afraid of strong people. He was afraid of visible people who didn't need his permission to be present. This is not offered as an excuse. It is offered as an explanation for why, when Victor Delano walked into Caruso's on a Tuesday evening in November, he looked at the woman at the back table and did what he always did. The room was full. Marcus was at the bar with 2 associates. Valentina had her laptop open and a secondary document on her screen that had been there for 4 days, a document that had nothing to do with Marcus Caruso's holdings. Delano arrived with 2 of his men. He moved through the room the way he always moved through rooms, checking in Prokwak na mai, taking out our chicken korikar or spy course to spot, bari ye chai. Corina Wing, says cataloging. He looked at Valentina the way certain men look at women they have already decided are not worth looking at, and then he said it, loudly enough for the nearest 3 tables to hear. They really will let anyone sit in here these days. A small smile at his companions. You'd think a place like this would have some kind of standard. One of his men laughed. The nearest table shifted uncomfortably. The young waiter who had been approaching suddenly found something important to attend to across the room. Valentina did not look up from her screen. Her fingers stopped moving for exactly 2 seconds. Then they started again. Must be nice, Delano continued, warming to an audience the way he always did, to just occupy space like that. No thought for how it looks to other people. Some people have absolutely no self-awareness at all. Valentina lifted her coffee, took a slow sip, and set it down. Then she looked at Delano, not with anger, not with hurt, but with the flat, measuring look of someone reading figures on a page. She said quietly and clearly, "Enjoy your dinner, Mr. Delano. Nothing else. No trembling, no exit." At the bar, Marcus had gone very still. He had heard every word. He was watching Valentina's face, not Delano's. What he saw there was not a performance of composure. She already had it, the way a person has something they have carried for long enough that carrying it no longer requires effort. Nobody in that room understood yet what they had just watched her not do. Delano ate his dinner. Marcus finished his conversation. Valentina closed her laptop at 10:15, said goodnight to the kitchen staff by name, and left. What nobody in that room knew was that she had been sitting at the back table for 4 days with a document that was going to end Victor Delano's operational life in this city, and that she had already decided she wasn't finished building it. 3 weeks earlier, a routine cross-reference in a logistics report had produced a discrepancy small enough to dismiss as a rounding error. Valentina had not dismissed it. She had pulled the thread, and the thread had led slowly through the patience of someone who understood that financial architecture is specifically designed to be unintelligible to people who don't speak its language, to a structure that was elegant in its construction and catastrophic in its implications. Victor Delano had been systematically siphoning money through a series of nominally independent freight companies into a fund that was financing a competing operation positioned to absorb 2 of Marcus's Southside distribution routes. It was not a crude play. It had planning and intelligence and the specific arrogance of a man who believed that the people around him were not watching carefully enough to notice. He was right about most of them. Valentina had the complete map. She had finished it 2 days before Delano walked into Caruso's and said what he said. She had been deciding not whether to use it, but when, because timing in her world was not a detail. Timing was the entire weapon. He had made exactly one miscalculation. He had assumed that the woman he insulted at the back table had no idea what he was doing. He was about to learn what that assumption cost. The evening Marcus would later describe as the most efficient thing he had witnessed in 30 years of business occurred on a Thursday, 2 days after Delano's dinner. Delano had arranged a formal sit-down at Caruso's, 4 men intersecting interests, the kind of meeting that required in-person presence. Valentina was at her back table. Delano had not looked at her when he came in. The meeting began at 7. At 7:43, Marcus's phone received a document. He read the first page. He asked everyone to excuse him for a moment. Valentina was standing behind him. "How long?" Marcus said, not looking up. "The structure is 14 months old," Valentina said. "Active phase began in March. I've mapped 23 transactions across 6 holding entities. The 2 routes he's targeting are the Kedzie corridor and the Lake Freight window. He has a meeting with the Petrov group scheduled for next week to finalize." Marcus looked up. He studied her face for a moment. "You've had this for how long?" 72 hours. "Why now?" Valentina held his gaze. "Because tonight is when it costs him the most to have it known." Marcus looked back at his phone, then out at the room where Delano was waiting. Then he said, "Stay." What happened in the following 40 minutes was the kind of scene that people in certain industries describe afterward in the passive voice, because the active voice requires naming a subject, and nobody in that room wanted to be responsible for naming Waratur. Chase for Marcus set his phone in front of Delano, showing the first 3 pages of Valentina's document. Delano's first response was a practiced performance of confusion. A genuinely competent performance, one that explained why he had survived as long as he had. Then Marcus said a specific name, then a specific dollar figure, then a date. The performance stopped. In her research on the psychology of exposure, Dr. Brené Brown has written with precision about the particular quality of shame that arrives not when we are seen at our worst, but when we are seen clearly by someone we had dismissed as beneath our notice, because it carries with it the unbearable recognition that our own contempt was the instrument of our undoing. Delano looked across the room to where Valentina stood at the back table. She had not moved. She met his eyes without expression. "Who?" he began. "Her name," Marcus said, "is Valentina Moreno. She has been working for me for 3 years." A pause that carried its full weight. "You may have seen her." Marcus's response to what followed was complete, methodical, and took less than a week. Delano's import license was suspended through a series of calls to a city official who had his own very good reasons to listen when Marcus Caruso spoke. His offshore accounts were flagged through an anonymous submission to a federal financial crimes unit of her Staromenchotsi Tatarowski Sturb Behar Chiwermuwchurwi Chawaron Chiwuri Pshiwi Stir Gannett submission containing enough specific documentation to guarantee months of review. His legitimate business partners received letters from various sources containing enough accurate detail to give each of them excellent reasons to restructure their relationships with him immediately. The Petrov meeting never happened. Victor Delano did not eat in public for a long time after that. The man who had needed to be the largest thing in every room he entered had walked into the wrong room and failed to understand the scale of what was already in it. On the Friday evening, following the Thursday meeting, after the last staff member had left, Marcus walked to the back table and sat down across from Valentina. He did not offer pleasantries. "You could have brought that document to me 3 days earlier," he said. "Yes, you chose not to." "I chose when it would do the most damage," she said. "Those are different things." Marcus was quiet. Research in behavioral decision-making, specifically Kahneman and Tversky's foundational work on how humans revise their assessments when confronted with evidence that contradicts their prior model, documents the way such revision is not always gradual. Sometimes it is instantaneous. Sometimes it arrives as correction rather than update. Marcus had spent 3 years with an incomplete picture of Valentina Moreno, and the picture he had been carrying was not adjusting. It was being replaced entirely. "I've been treating you like support staff," he said. Valentina picked up her coffee. "I know. That changes. She looked at him over the rim. What does that mean, specifically? Marcus, who did not make speeches and had not in 44 years offered many people an explanation of himself, said, "It means you sit at the table. Not this table. The table. Your name on the documents that matter. When someone comes to me with a money problem, they go to you and they know what they're going to. It means I stop walking past you." He paused. "It also means I'd like to have dinner with you, an actual dinner, where I sit at your table." Outside, Chicago in November was the same city it had always been, cold, dense, and indifferent to the private arrangements of power occurring in its back rooms. But something had shifted in one of those back rooms, quietly and without announcement, the way all structural things shift, not with a crash, but with a click. Valentina Moreno had not waited to be found. She had built the conditions under which being found was the only remaining option, and Marcus Caruso, who had spent a career understanding leverage, recognized in that something he had recognized in very few things in his life, something worth building around. The world she hadn't fit was a world too careless to look. He wasn't interested in that world anymore either. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen by someone worth being seen by. Valentina spent 3 years and used the time to learn everything. If this story stayed with you, leave it a like. It takes a second, and it's how I know to keep finding stories like this one. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one, because the story I'm telling next is darker, and the woman at the center of it is even more dangerous.